Xenoblade Chronicles 3, a game whose core idea I'd been theorizing about for a very long time, is finally upon us. I know, I'm spectacularly late on this one, but I definitely haven't been an exception to the endless theorizing about this minute-and-a-half trailer, because when I look at Xenoblade 3, I see something that I've been considering ever since Xenoblade 2 came out, and brought the Perfect Work story back into the forefront. Finally, for the first time, Xeno has an opportunity to bring the narrative outline that's been the series' backbone ever since the beginning to a close, with the contents of the 6th and final episode looking like they might actually be within reach. More than a little bit crazy, and somewhat surreal for someone like me, who found this series before Xenoblade even existed, but right after the disaster of Xenosaga's failure, when it seemed as though Xeno might never again be given that chance. But I digress. There's obviously a lot throughout the trailer that jumped out to me. Clues about the context, lore, narrative, and mechanics, of course, but also how this game could be bringing together concepts from the previous games into one final push for the finale of the long-running 24-year project that is the Perfect Works timeline. So, allow me to introduce and explain my theory for what Xenoblade 3 might be about. Klaus's Curse on the Universe. Fog, King, Overflow. For anyone who hasn't played at least some of these games, this video will contain spoilers for Xenoblade 1, 2, and Xenosaga, which is pretty much the framework of this idea. If you're caught up, or you don't mind spoilers for any of those games, welcome. I'm Rudra, your host tonight. I hope you enjoy this video, and if you do, why not consider subscribing? Anyway, all set? Let's go! Much like Torna, the Golden Country added to the main game of Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Future Connected focuses on the character and story of Melia, after the events of the main scenario come to a close. Why Melia, and not Fiora, Rein, Dunban, Sharla, or Ricky, you might ask? Well, that's because this scenario isn't simply a new story to be told, but a waystone of sorts, pointing towards the future. The events that take place, and the words spoken by the characters in Future Connected, are linked to the future of Xenoblade Chronicles itself. It's our hope at Monolith that, as you experience the new scenario, you'll enjoy dreaming of what sort of future that might be. Ever since Definitive Edition released, that statement has been the foundation of my speculation. From retaking Alchemoth, to potentially saving the pure Hyentia, and Melia's embodiment of hope, Future Connected really seemed to be establishing some sort of potential moving forward. But what caught my eye above all else was everything surrounding the Rift and the Fog King. In so many ways, this thing basically had the properties of one of Xenosaga's Gnosis. With the multiverse thread blown wide open by Xenoblade 2, FC went even further. The Fog King existed in a dimension separate from the physical world, and couldn't be so much as interacted with physically, let alone fought. It was only made tangible to the cast when Shulk invented something akin to the Hilbert effect, drawing the Fog King into their plane of reality and letting them fight it. Even the Fog Beasts could be compared to Nosification, as coming into that sort of contact with it transforms them into fogged beings, imbued with the King's essence. The missing point is, of course, a Gnosis being made of salt, and turning people into salt. But that could just be something that was reimagined, like so many other things in this series. In this case, substituting salt for fog. My point is, something like a Gnosis existing at all in their world is a huge deal. It means that the way the universe is structured in Xenoblade could be pretty similar to how Xenosaga was set up, with all the caveats that brings. In case it's been a while, or you're new to this and still watching for some reason, Saga's universe is divided into two major components, the upper and lower domains. The upper domain is almost entirely unknowable and inaccessible, a realm only within sight to others through entities that reach down and observe from that plane of existence. And the lower domain is our own world, which is itself further divided into two subdomains of its own. The first is the realm we know, what Xenosaga calls the real number domain, our visible universe. It's home to the physical forms of all life, pretty much the substance and flesh of any material thing that exists. The second is essentially its spiritual counterpart, the imaginary number domain, or the space where anything and everything exists on a more conceptual level. Humans, machines, planets. If it exists in our world, it extends into this realm as an abstraction. If you were to take how humans extend into it, it's where their consciousness and heart, or even their will, exists, separate from their physical bodies. When someone dies in the real number domain, their consciousness is still there in the imaginary number domain. Without a link to their physical form, though, they're gradually absorbed into a wider composite of deceased souls, settling into that universe's natural mental coexistence that we know as unus mundus, or the collective unconscious. That basically means that the structure of consciousness in the imaginary number domain is a state of total and complete unification, with no perceivable boundaries. Why does this matter? Because the gnosis are what happens when someone fears the characteristics of the collective unconscious and rejects becoming a part of it, choosing instead to escape. That rejection is a problem. To use one of Xenosaga's own examples, if 9 people withdraw from a group of 10, they can no longer be called a group. This is a death spiral, where more and more souls over time begin to reject becoming one, manifest as gnosis, scatter and disperse across the imaginary number domain, and flow into the real number domain without end. It's the collective unconscious itself diffusing, overwhelming its own realm, which would cause more than just it to collapse. Xenosaga's universe is deeply interwoven. Both halves of the lower domain are like 2 sides of the same coin. Everything in one exists in the other. If the imaginary number domain collapses, the whole of the lower domain goes with it. And if the lower domain collapses, the whole of the upper domain goes too. It means that anything that causes one realm to scatter leads to the whole universe dispersing into nothing. That is the crisis of systems collapse. The gnosis existing in Xenoblade's setting is like a harbinger of disaster. It means that, well...
Disaster. Complete ruin. Inescapably looming over our future. I know not why, but that is the vague dread that I feel when I consider the rift.
Say then, we take this line of thought and extrapolate from it, under the assumption that Xenoblade's universe operates similarly to Xenosaga's universe. Doing so much as a surface-level visual analysis of Aionios should reveal to anyone familiar with the worlds of Xenoblade 1 and 2 just how chaotic and messy the merger was for both settings. The Fallen Arm fused with parts of the landmass, Leftharian Islands amidst the water of Aerith Sea, Uriah detached from the land it joined with and split down the middle, the sword of the Mechonis somehow thrust right into the reborn Earth, despite its ultimate fate. It appears to me that, however it happened, this unification was extremely precarious, and probably had a pretty dramatic effect on the structure of their reality. I mean, it's hard to get any more dramatic than worlds quite literally crashing into one another. But what I'm saying is that it seems plausible that this event could have destabilized the universe, not unlike the end of the Miltian conflict in Xenosaga, which saw the trickle of gnosis into the real number domain become a flood. So, say the Fog King in Future Connected was a sighting that happened before unification. Just as gnosis were reported to appear very rarely throughout Xenosaga's history before the Miltian conflict, and began to skyrocket afterwards, the initial encounter with the Fog King in the Rift, omen though it was, could have been something similar to those rare sightings, a breakthrough event, perhaps caused by Xenoblade 1's branching dimension beginning to come apart at the seams, perhaps just the properties of the world Alvis rebuilt. Either way, if unification is Xenoblade's equivalent to the Miltian conflict, it could very well have been disruptive enough to the fabric of reality to have triggered a Fog King overflow. In other words, a thinning out of the collective unconscious, and the beginning of that death spiral that I talked about earlier, scattering and flowing outwards until it can no longer be maintained, and then dispersing into nothingness. This could be the true nature of the crisis that Aionios faces, an existential threat hanging over the world with its every breath. And that begs a rather obvious question. What, then, are the people of Aionios doing about it, if anything at all? Xenosaga's people, at the beginning of the Perfect Works episodic timeline, had time to figure out a counter, but Xenoblade Chronicles 3, on the opposite end, and potentially holding the position of 6th and final episode, doesn't have that kind of room to breathe. when you think of it like that, any solution needs to have been one that they've already found and implemented, for Aionios to have maintained its existence for the presumable 1 to 2 centuries that it's been around. And perhaps it's a solution that we've already heard, one that was outlined at the very beginning of this game's reveal trailer.
Fighting in order to live, and living to fight. That's the way of our world. Aionios.
If the collective unconscious, and thus reality itself, are unstable because of a domino effect of souls rejecting unity out of violently negative human emotions, how would you counteract that? How could you ensure that the souls of the fallen not only accept unification peacefully, but also quickly enough to stall the fragmentation, replenish the system, and keep the problem from getting any worse? That line, that singular line spoken to the backdrop of Noah playing the flute, is a clue to the answer. It's framed as the foundation of how Aionios functions as a setting. While you can take it as simply the reality of a constant state of vicious and lethal war, I see this line in a different light. Suppose that we, instead, take this line very, very literally. The message would become something along the lines of, conflict is a fundamental, even necessary part of Aionios' continued existence. The brutality of war, the price paid by those involved, the death and destruction that naturally result, a cycle, a way of life, and a wild, constant offering of consciousness to the imaginary number domain. Because, yes, this is a huge amount of people that would be killed. Enough to where both Kves and Agnes have a military position specifically targeting it, the Offsears. Offsears are people that, through playing music on their flutes, mourn for those that have lost their lives on the field of battle, which is a terrible burden to place upon somebody in its own right, but may be something imposed upon them, for a purpose that runs far deeper than just respect for the fallen. They might in fact be the linchpin, the key to the solution, that, in this scenario, Aionios had to have built to counteract systems collapse. From Takahashi's first message about Xenoblade 3, it seems clear that the flute, and by extension the Offsears, are going to be in some way more than simply a method by which to mourn the dead, and will, in fact, play into the theme of life. Faced with life's end, perhaps mourning through the flute is a way to soothe the soul of the fallen, return their physical forms to ether, and see off a tranquil consciousness that can now peacefully integrate into the collective unconscious. We do see ether particles flowing around the Offsears every time they're shown playing the flutes, so maybe a good analogy for this idea could be something along the lines of the Ham's ritual of returning life to the Bionis upon death, only here it's feeding souls into the Unus Mundus to offset the scattering. It's something that would be constantly visible too, given that the fog that surrounded Alchemoth, the King, and the Rift are spread all throughout Aionios. A constant reminder of the on-edge nature of a world where the slightest relaxation of this could mean the end of everything. It's even in the visual of the game's title, where the logo is dissolving, submitting to the fog particles, scattering into the wind. If that idea is taken to its logical conclusion, it begins to sound almost like an organized, pre-planned affair, and maybe that's exactly what it is. From this theory's point of view, with Kves and Agnes backed into the proverbial corner, they could have agreed upon a mutually beneficial war in order to, in a very twisted sense, join forces in a cooperative effort to preserve the future of the post-unification world. An eternal, everlasting war to create a raw foundation of sacrificial lambs, and the Offsears to forge life's end into a dam capable of standing against the onslaught of a fundamentally unstable universe on the edge of collapse. In that way, as far as their characters go, maybe Nia and Melia's reasoning for this war is a desperate bid to preserve the futures that they and their friends fought so hard to create and protect. What happens when the only way to do that, to maintain the bonds of a world where humans and blades walk towards the future together, to safeguard the hope of a world where the peoples of two realms live alongside one another in harmony, is to intertwine them in an unending circle, an Ouroboros of war, for the legacy of life that they wish to continue. In fact, if we were to return to Future Connected one more time, we might have seen a hint to the spirit of this idea once before, at the end of the final battle against the Fog King. If you take a look at that encounter, the Rift maintained the Fog King's ability to return from anything, even after being hit with Shulk's version of the Hilbert effect. That changed only when the Telethia began flying into the Rift en masse, disrupting it and allowing Melia to destroy the Fog King for good. Future Connected decided to leave this phenomenon unexplained, but if you look at it through the lens of systems collapse, an idea begins to emerge. If the Rift is a wound in reality, torn open by the Fog King's rejection flowing into the real number domain, maybe what was actually happening was the tortured souls of the Hyentia sacrificing their physical forms to attain peace, and freeing their consciousness in the imaginary number domain from the prison of their Telethia bodies. They would then be absorbed into the collective unconscious, and offset the initial rejection, sealing the rift between the two subdomains, and isolating the Fog King. And if that's the case, then the future of the new world would have been kept safe through the very same sacrificial process that I just described. Maybe it's even the source of how Aionios came upon their solution, actions and words connected to the future of Xenoblade Chronicles itself. In the end, as a final point to this theory, I want to take a look at the inverse of that statement, because hidden within Xenoblade's most distant past may be the initial damage to the collective unconscious that set this all into motion. A single man's desperation in a world devouring itself through its own hubristic actions. Klaus's experiment. Let's connect back to how Xenosaga's universe functions one last time. In their equivalent to the experiment, Chief Grimoire Verum, using a Zohar control program that connects the upper and lower domains, conducted a link experiment meant to shift humanity to the upper domain and ascend to become as gods. But the Zohar went berserk, causing a local matter shift and the disappearance of people all across the world. The phenomenon spread and spread and spread, until humanity had no choice but to flee the Earth's range into the wider universe. What the local matter shift did was to shift existences from the real number domain to the imaginary number domain, appearing from the physical universe as people vanishing entirely.
You have seen the plane called Moritha, have you not? That is what remains of my world. When I opened the conduit, many people and many things disappeared into distant dimensions.
Let's say that Klaus's experiment operated in a similar manner. This could explain why the Guldos look like the Fog King. They, the unfortunate ones who clung to life, might not actually be that far removed from being Gnosis, souls that reject what death means for their consciousness. After all, their survival depended entirely on core crystals implanted in their heads, something they did in the hopes of attaining immortality. Through those crystals, they maintained their grip on a physical form, even as the matter shift ravaged their bodies beyond recognition, leaving them as the only surviving life on Earth, as everything and everyone else was shifted into the imaginary number domain, including the facet of Klaus that wished for divinity, Galea, and all of what would become the dimension of Bionis and Mechonis. If we follow that line of logic, then the Endless Sea, the world of Xenoblade Chronicles, was only ever a construct within the imaginary number domain. A universe-sized body acting as an extension of the real number domain, filled with physical existences, all in a realm meant only to house the spiritual. That would be an incredibly destabilizing force, a nagging wound dealt to the domain. and completely unsustainable without the stabilizing effect of the Zohar. Perhaps, once that force was gone, the world of Xenoblade Chronicles could no longer sustain itself, and began to be reabsorbed into the physical universe, eventually crashing right into the world from where all its matter originated. It would be a ticking time bomb, one that wasn't existential while it still ticked, but became dire when it exploded and the effects of interdimensional instability began to be felt. That might be the final legacy of the experiment on those descended from its aftermath. The ultimate culmination of the echoes ringing out across the ages. The curse of Klaus and the last war.